My aunt stayed with Grandma Eleanor, claiming to be her caregiver, but when I found Grandma's original will and proof of forgery, I realized my helpful aunt was actually trying to steal the entire estate. I never considered myself someone prone to suspicion. My life, until recently, had been one of steady, predictable rhythms. My graphic design career, my small but comfortable apartment, the occasional weekend trip with friends. My family was a source of comfort, albeit a distant one. My parents, bless them, were more concerned with their own quiet retirement than the specifics of their adult children's lives. My grandmother, however, was a different story. My grandma Eleanor. She was the anchor of our extended family, a force of nature even into her late 80s. Her house, a sturdy Victorian on a tree-lined street in my childhood town of Oakhaven, wasn't just a building. It was the repository of decades of family history, Sunday dinners, and the faint scent of lemon polish and old books. When she passed away peacefully 6 months ago, I was devastated, but also felt a strange sense of peace, knowing she was no longer suffering from the slow decline of age. She had lived a full life, and her house was her legacy. As the closest relative who wasn't actively embroiled in her own drama, I was tasked with handling the estate. My parents, bless them again, were too overwhelmed by their own memories. My father, Eleanor's son, had died years before. My mother, Eleanor's daughter, was too frail and easily distressed. So it fell to me, Emily, 32, graphic designer, to make the trip back to Oakhaven, sort through the affairs, and decide the house's future. The problem wasn't the inheritance itself. Grandma Eleanor had a straightforward will, drafted years ago, leaving the house and most of her assets to me, with smaller bequests to other family members. The problem, as it turned out, was Carol. Carol is my aunt, my father's younger sister. We'd always been polite. Carol had stayed in Oakhaven, lived with Grandma Eleanor for the past 10 years, ostensibly as her primary caregiver after Grandpa passed and Eleanor's mobility began to falter. She'd never married, never pursued a career outside of a few years working in local administration. Her life seemed to revolve around her parents, then around Grandma Eleanor. When I arrived in Oakhaven, Carol was the first one at the door. She brought a casserole, a sympathetic smile, and a meticulously organized binder labeled Grandma Eleanor's Final Wishes. She was, on the surface, the picture of grief-stricken, helpful family. "Oh, Emily, darling, thank goodness you're here," she'd said, enveloping me in a hug that smelled faintly of lavender and something sharp, like cleaning fluid. "It's been so hard. You have no idea." She insisted on taking charge of everything. "You just rest, sweetie. I've got it all under control. The will, the funeral arrangements, all of it. Grandma and I talked about everything, you know." She was very clear about what she wanted. This was the first faint tremor. "Grandma and I talked about everything." Grandma Eleanor, bless her, was sharp as a tack right up until her final weeks. But her communication could be colorful. She'd often change her mind, have new wishes after watching a news segment or talking to a neighbor. To say she had one fixed plan, especially one she hadn't mentioned to me, felt a little off. But I chalked it up to grief, to Carol trying to feel useful. The next few days were a blur of sorting through decades of belongings. Carol was always there, hovering. She'd pick up photos and say things like, "Oh, this is a lovely memory, but perhaps best not to dwell on it. Let's focus on the positive." Or she'd open drawers, sigh dramatically, and mutter, "Grandma really should have let me organize these files better." It felt like she was subtly trying to rewrite history, or at least curate my access to it. Then came the first concrete oddity. I was looking for Grandma's original will, the one she'd shown me years ago, just to have a copy for my records. Carol said, "Oh, darling, I think that got misplaced during the last move. Don't worry, though, I have a copy of the will right here," producing a binder with a single official-looking document. As I glanced at it, my stomach did a slow flip. It was a will, all right, but it was dated much later than the one I remembered. And the bequests, they were different. Not drastically, but noticeably. The house was still primarily mine, but a significant portion of the liquid assets, and crucially, a specific antique grandfather clock that Grandma had always promised me, were now earmarked for Carol. "This is new," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Carol waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Grandma changed her mind a few times. She wanted to make sure I was taken care of, given how much I sacrificed for her. It's only right, isn't it?" She smiled, but her eyes didn't quite match her expression. I felt a prickle of suspicion, but I pushed it down. Carol had been living with Grandma, handling her day-to-day affairs. Maybe Grandma had changed her mind. Maybe she had made new verbal promises, and this was just the legal testament to that. I didn't want to believe my aunt was manipulative, not when we were both grieving. But the unease lingered. I remembered Grandma Eleanor's fierce protectiveness of her financial documents. She kept everything in a heavy old metal box in her study closet, a box she never let anyone else touch. Carol mentioned it was long gone, and that she'd sorted all that out. The real jolt came when I was helping Carol clear out Grandma's old desk. We found a small locked wooden box tucked away in the back of a bottom drawer. Carol immediately said, "Oh, that's just junk, dear. Probably old buttons or something. Let's throw it out." But something about her urgency made me pause. I found Grandma's old sewing kit, and a tiny key that fit perfectly. Inside the box, beneath a layer of dried flowers, were not buttons but several of Grandma's old diaries, her medical records, and crucially, a bundle of old bank statements and loan documents. Scrolling through the statements, I found a series of transactions that made no sense. Payments to a law firm I'd never heard of, significant cash withdrawals that weren't accounted for in any household budget Carol had presented, and what looked like a personal loan taken out against the house just last year. The signatures on these documents, they looked rushed, shaky, not definitively forged, but not quite right. And the dates coincided with times Carol had been managing Grandma's affairs. My heart started to pound. This was no longer about misplaced kindness or grief-induced forgetfulness. This felt deliberate. This felt like a setup. I carefully photographed everything with my phone, then put it all back, locked the box, and put it back in the drawer, just as Carol had wanted. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already starting to grow into something I could no longer ignore. The contents of that small wooden box felt like a Pandora's box for my already troubled mind. I'd photographed everything: the loans, the strange withdrawals, the signatures that looked off, and Carol's hurried attempt to discard it all. I returned the box to the drawer, locking it with the tiny key, a secret I now carried in my pocket. The facade of sibling grief and helpfulness that Carol presented to the rest of the family felt increasingly paper-thin, and I could feel the foundations of my trust in her beginning to crumble. I decided to play along, to be the calm, agreeable niece while I pieced together the truth. Carol, perhaps sensing I discovered something or perhaps just wanting to solidify her narrative, became even more insistent about the finality of Grandma Eleanor's wishes. She'd casually mention how Grandma had finally realized how much Carol had done for her, how she owed Carol everything. She even started referring to the newer will as the only one that matters, subtly downplaying the one I remembered. The financial discrepancies were too significant to ignore. Those cash withdrawals, the loan against the house, these weren't small oversights. I remembered Grandma Eleanor's frugality, her almost obsessive need to keep meticulous records of every penny. She'd kept her financial documents in that metal box in the closet. The one Carol claimed was sorted out. When I discreetly checked the closet, it was empty, save for a faint outline on the floor where the box must have sat. Carol had already disposed of it, or so she thought. I began spending my days not just sorting through sentimental items, but meticulously comparing the few financial papers I'd found against the newer will Carol had produced. I needed more. I needed to know if the signatures on those loan documents were genuinely Grandma's. I discreetly contacted my old college roommate, Mark, who was now a junior associate at a law firm, specializing in estate disputes. I explained the situation, emphasizing the potential for elder financial abuse and forgery. "Emily," Mark said, his voice serious, "this sounds like a serious case. If Carol has been manipulating your grandmother and forging documents, there are legal channels. First, try to get copies of all official financial records related to your grandmother's estate. Bank statements, loan applications, the original will, any notary logs from recent years. You'll need to subpoena these if necessary. And get photos of your grandmother's current signature if possible, or use older, undisputed signatures for comparison. Document everything you find and everything Carol says or does that seems suspicious. Be precise. Dates, times, witnesses." The thought of legal action felt daunting, especially against my own aunt. But the alternative, letting Carol potentially fleece my grandmother's legacy and exploit her declining health, was unbearable. Carol, meanwhile, seemed to relish her role as the grieving, overworked caregiver. She'd sigh theatrically when I'd ask about her day, or lament about how exhausting it was to manage Grandma's affairs. She'd try to involve me in her caretaking decisions, but always with a subtle undertone of undermining my authority or knowledge. "Oh, did you see the new medication list? Grandma was confused yesterday, so I changed the dosage. You probably wouldn't have known being away so much." Or, "I know you think we need to keep that antique vase, Emily, but Grandma said I should have it. She wanted to make sure I had something special after all I've done." She also began to subtly isolate me from other family members. When my parents called, Carol would often intercept the conversation, relaying her own version of events. "Emily's overwhelmed," she'd tell them. "She's not quite grasping the complexity of Grandma's situation." She'd steer conversations away from finances, claiming it was too upsetting for Grandma, or that I was making things unnecessarily complicated. One afternoon, while Carol was out for her regular coffee break, which I suspected was actually a meeting with someone to discuss these financial matters, I decided to try and find Grandma's original will. I knew she kept important documents in a fireproof box in her study. Carol had said it was already handled, but I needed to see it for myself. I searched the study, checking closets, drawers, even behind furniture. Finally, tucked away in a seldom-used hat box on the top shelf of the wardrobe, I found it. The old familiar will. It was dated 10 years prior, meticulously signed, witnessed, and notarized. It left the house to me with specific sentimental bequests to other family members, including the grandfather clock to me. There was no mention of significant cash sums going to Carol. Comparing it side by side with the copy Carol had produced was sickening. The date was only 6 months ago. The signature looked similar but somehow flatter. Less character. The witnesses were unfamiliar names. And the bequests were as Carol had described. It was clear. The document Carol presented was a fabrication, likely created after Grandma Eleanor's health had deteriorated enough for her to be susceptible to manipulation, or perhaps even outright forgery. My mind raced. How did she do it? Did she forge the signature? Did she coerce Grandma into signing something she didn't understand? Did she use her access to other documents to create a believable fake? The photos from the wooden box showed scanned loan applications with that same shaky, possibly forged signature. I carefully photographed the original will and its accompanying notary details. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. Carol was returning soon, and I didn't want her to know I'd discovered the truth about the original will. I went downstairs, my heart pounding, my mind a whirlwind of suspicion and resolve. I knew I couldn't tackle this alone. I needed professional help. I decided to contact the attorney Mark had recommended, specifically one experienced in elder financial abuse cases. The time for passive observation was over. Update 1. The tiny key to Grandma Eleanor's wooden box felt heavy in my pocket, a tangible symbol of the truth I'd unearthed. The original will, tucked away by Grandma herself, was a stark contrast to the newer document Carol had presented. A document filled with altered bequests and questionable signatures. The world had tilted on its axis, and my carefully maintained emotional equilibrium was starting to crack. My first call, after carefully securing all the documents and photos from the box, was to Mark's recommended lawyer, Mr. Harrison. I explained the situation, omitting no detail: Grandma's declining health, Carol's pervasive presence, the misplaced original will, the new document with its suspect signature and witnesses, the cash withdrawals, the loan against the house. Mr. Harrison listened patiently, his voice calm and professional. "Emily," he began, "what you're describing is concerning. Elder financial abuse and potential forgery are serious matters. The first step is to verify the authenticity of the documents. I'll need you to bring me everything you found: the original will, the copy Carol provided, the loan documents, the bank statements, even the photographs of the signatures. We can get a forensic document examiner to compare the signatures on the loan applications and the newer will against known, undisputed samples of your grandmother's signature." He explained the process: obtaining official bank records and notary logs via subpoena, engaging experts to analyze the signatures and digital timestamps, and building a solid case for potential legal action, whether to contest the will or pursue fraud charges. This can be a long and emotionally taxing process, Emily, he warned. It's vital you maintain a clear, objective record of all communications and events, and try not to tip your hand to Carol until we're ready. Armed with this advice, my mission became clearer, but also more dangerous. I had to be a detective in my own family's tragedy. Carol, meanwhile, seemed to sense a shift. My quiet research, my slightly more guarded demeanor, or perhaps just my proximity to the truth, made her more restless. She started accusing me of stirring up trouble and not respecting Grandma's final wishes. "You're making this so difficult, Emily," she sighed one evening. "While we were supposed to be clearing out Grandma's attic, Grandma wouldn't want us fighting like this. She wanted peace. I just wish you'd let things be settled quietly." She then proceeded to accidentally drop a stack of old photo albums, scattering pictures across the dusty floor, including one of Grandma Eleanor and me from my high school graduation. As I picked them up, I noticed Carol subtly examining the photos of Grandma's signature on the back, perhaps assessing their authenticity against her fabricated documents. She also began actively trying to turn other family members against me. My parents, bless their hearts, were largely out of the loop, trusting Carol's narrative of Emily being overwhelmed and misguided. But my Aunt Susan, Grandma Eleanor's sister, who lived a few towns over, called me with a worried tone. "Carol was just here, darling. She's so worried about you, Emily. Says you're not coping well. She mentioned something about you wanting to sell the house before Grandma was even gone. Is that true?" My stomach sank. Carol was actively creating a false impression of my intentions. I tried to engage my parents indirectly, sending them benign updates about Grandma's garden, but avoiding any mention of financial matters. I figured the less they knew, the less they could be manipulated or used as witnesses against me. It felt cold but necessary. The digital aspect of Carol's potential deception gnawed at me. Grandma Eleanor had a very old laptop that Carol had tidied away after the move. While Carol was out for one of her frequent errands, which I now suspected involved meetings or phone calls related to her scheme, I located the laptop. It was dusty and used but functional. On a hunch, I tried the password Grandma used for everything. Her birthday, followed by her maiden name's first letter. It worked. The hard drive was mostly empty, as if recently wiped. But using a file recovery tool Mark had suggested, I managed to retrieve fragments of deleted files. Among them were scanned copies of Grandma's signature from various documents, including loan applications. And then I found it. A partially deleted email draft addressed to a law firm, the same one mentioned in Carol's new will documents, discussing estate adjustments and referencing the donor's clear directives. The draft was saved with a file name that included a date from just 2 months ago. It was a clear digital trace of Carol's actions, showing she had been in contact with legal counsel regarding altering the estate, using potentially fabricated information. This was more than circumstantial. This was hard digital evidence. I saved everything to my encrypted drive, feeling a mix of grim satisfaction and overwhelming dread. I had proof that Carol was actively working to change the estate, likely through illicit means, and that she had been corresponding with a law firm about it. The next day, Carol announced a family meeting for that weekend, claiming it was to discuss Grandma's final wishes and ensure everyone is on the same page. She specifically asked me to bring all relevant documents for transparency. I knew this was it, the moment of truth. She was either trying to box me in with her fabricated narrative or genuinely intended to present her version of events to the wider family. Either way, I had to be ready. I contacted Mr. Harrison again, armed with my new findings and the evidence from Grandma's laptop. He agreed that this was critical. "Be prepared to present your findings calmly and methodically, Emily. Let your evidence speak for itself. If Carol presents a different will, you'll need to immediately point out the discrepancies and request an independent forensic verification of all documents and signatures before any decisions are made." As I prepared for the family meeting, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I was no longer just a grieving granddaughter sorting through belongings. I was an investigator, a potential whistleblower, and a defender of my grandmother's true legacy. And I knew with chilling certainty that this weekend would determine the future not only of Grandma's estate, but of my family itself. Update 2. The drive to Oak Haven for the family meeting felt like driving into a trap. The air in my car was thick with the scent of my own fear, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed calm I was trying to project. Carol had sent out the invitation via a family group chat, framing it as a necessary step to honor Grandma Eleanor's wishes and ensure transparency. The subtext, I knew, was her attempt to legitimize her fabricated will and solidify her position before anyone could question her too deeply. My parents, bless their hearts, expressed only relief that we were all coming together. Aunt Susan, however, had called me privately, sounding worried. "Carol's been acting strange, Emily. Really strange. Keep your wits about you." The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Grandma's house. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, my stomach clenched. Carol's car was already there, along with my parents' and Aunt Susan's. Carol emerged from the house as I approached, beaming, holding her binder of documents like a shield. "Emily, darling. So glad you could make it. We've all been waiting for you." Her voice was a little too bright, her smile a little too wide. Inside, the living room, usually filled with Grandma's warmth and the faint scent of lemon polish, felt tense and alien. My parents sat on the sofa, looking frail and a bit lost. Aunt Susan sat in an armchair, her expression observant and subtly concerned. Carol had arranged everything on the coffee table, a neat stack of papers, the new will prominently displayed, alongside printed emails and what looked like financial summaries. "All right, everyone," Carol began, her voice taking on a businesslike tone. "Thank you for coming. I know this is difficult, but Grandma wanted us to handle things with clarity and respect. I've compiled everything based on her final wishes, which she expressed very clearly to me in her last few months." She then proceeded to lay out her narrative. Grandma Eleanor, feeling her memory slip, had decided to revise her will to reflect the immense support Carol had provided. She talked about the late nights, the sacrifices, the overwhelming financial burden of care that only Carol had truly handled. The new will, she explained, was a reflection of that gratitude, ensuring Carol was properly compensated for her dedication. She slid the newer will across the table, pointing to the bequests. Then she brought out the printed emails. "Here are some of Grandma's recent messages to me, clarifying her intentions. And these are the final loan documents and payment approvals she signed off on." She held up scans of those shaky signatures. "It's all here, documented." My parents listened, nodding along, looking confused but trusting Carol's confident presentation. Aunt Susan, however, met my eyes, a silent question hanging between us. It was my cue. Taking a deep breath, I spoke, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Carol," I started. "Thank you for organizing this. It's good to have everyone together." I paused, letting the moment settle. "But I do have some concerns, and I've done a bit of my own organizing to ensure we're all looking at the same picture." I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted folder. I didn't launch into accusations. Instead, I began by presenting my findings logically. First, I managed to locate Grandma's original will from a few years ago. "It's right here," I said, carefully placing the document on the table. "It differs slightly from the one Carol presented. For example, the grandfather clock and a portion of the savings were originally intended for me, not significantly reallocated." Carol's smile tightened. "Oh, Emily, we discussed this. Grandma changed her mind. And that brings me to the next point," I continued, pulling out my own phone. "I found these copies on Grandma's old laptop, which I was able to recover." I showed them the deleted files from the laptop's hard drive, the scanned loan documents with those shaky signatures, the incomplete draft email to the law firm discussing estate adjustments and donors' clear directives, saved with a date only months ago. The signatures on these, and on the newer will Carol presented, appear to be inconsistent with Grandma's known signature from this original will and other undisputed documents. I've also had them preliminarily reviewed by a forensic document examiner. I scrolled to show them the photographic comparison Mark had helped me compile. The difference was subtle but distinct. A lack of natural flow, a flattened quality. Then I presented the scanned email draft to the law firm. This draft was found on Grandma's laptop, but it was created and saved from a computer that matches Carol's personal device's IP address, not Grandma's. It also references communication with the law firm that handled the new will, and the date it was saved is after Grandma was no longer able to conduct complex legal business independently. The room went silent. My parents looked from my phone to Carol, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Carol's smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of indignant shock. This is outrageous. Emily, how dare you accuse me? You're twisting everything. Grandma wanted this. Her voice rose, cracking with forced emotion. You're just jealous because you weren't here. You didn't do anything. Aunt Susan, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Carol, darling, the handwriting on that loan agreement. It doesn't look like Grandma's usual script. And Emily's proof is quite detailed. What do you say to that? Carol turned on Aunt Susan, then on my parents, her composure shattering. You're all against me. I'm the one who sacrificed everything, who stayed and cared for her. And this is how you repay me. By believing her lies. She grabbed the binder, her hands trembling. This is the real will. You can't change that. Mr. Harrison, the lawyer I'd hired, arrived then, his presence adding a layer of official gravity to the unfolding drama. He calmly listened to Carol's increasingly frantic denials and my concise presentation of the evidence. He requested the binder and the documents Carol had brought. After a brief examination, he confirmed my suspicions. Carol, based on the preliminary review and the evidence Emily has presented, there are significant discrepancies that require further legal investigation. The signatures on the documents you've provided appear inconsistent with undisputed samples, and the digital evidence suggests potential manipulation. Until this is fully resolved, all estate matters will be put on hold, and a court-appointed administrator may be necessary. The air went out of the room. Carol slumped back, defeated, tears of fury and humiliation streaming down her face. My parents looked utterly bewildered, caught in a crossfire they couldn't comprehend. Aunt Susan simply looked at Carol with a sad, disappointed expression. The family meeting ended not with closure, but with a legal stalemate. The house was effectively frozen, its future uncertain, and the relationships within our family were irrevocably fractured. I had exposed the truth, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the messy, painful reality of family betrayal. The path forward was clear, but it was a path through legal battles and irreparable damage, not one of shared grief and comfort. Final update. The fallout from that family meeting was, predictably, anything but peaceful. The moment Mr. Harrison confirmed the authenticity concerns and the potential for fraud, Carol's carefully constructed world imploded. She stormed out of Grandma Eleanor's living room, vowing to fight this to the end, and immediately cut off all communication with me, my parents, and Aunt Susan. Her narrative shifted from the grieving caregiver to the wronged victim, painting me as a greedy opportunist trying to steal her rightful inheritance. The legal process that followed was exactly as arduous and emotionally draining as Mr. Harrison had warned. Subpoenas were issued for Carol's personal devices, bank records, and communications with the fraudulent law firm. Forensic experts meticulously analyzed the signatures, confirming they were indeed forged, likely using scans from Grandma's old documents that Carol had obtained from the wooden box. The analysis of Carol's devices revealed her search history, queries about how to forge a signature, transferring property with dementia, best AI for voice cloning, and correspondence with a shady online service that specialized in creating fake legal documents. The nice young woman with a clipboard, who had supposedly facilitated the new will with Grandma, was never identified, presumably a phantom created by Carol. The outcome was clear. Carol had attempted to defraud the estate and her own family. The legal proceedings were ultimately swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Carol settled out of court, relinquishing any claim to the house or the significant assets she had tried to siphon. She received nothing beyond a small pre-existing familial bequest, and the house was transferred to me as per Grandma Eleanor's original, undisputed will. It was a legal victory, a vindication of sorts, but it felt more like a surgical removal than a triumph. The cost, however, was far greater than any financial loss Carol might have incurred. The betrayal fractured our family in ways that felt irreparable. My parents, once caught between their trust in Carol and my own evidence, were devastated by the truth. They struggled to reconcile the image of their loving niece with the reality of her actions. While they supported my efforts, the conflict within them was palpable, and their relationship with Carol became permanently strained, marked by guilt and disappointment. Aunt Susan, who had always been perceptive, offered me quiet support, But even she admitted the entire situation had cast a dark shadow over their family gatherings. My relationship with Carol was, of course, completely severed. There was no possibility of reconciliation, no shared grief that could bridge the chasm of deceit. I mourned not only Grandma Eleanor but also the aunt I thought I knew, the family bonds I'd taken for granted. The experience left me deeply changed. The quiet, unassuming graphic designer who just wanted to sort through her grandmother's belongings was gone. In her place was someone more vigilant, more suspicious, and profoundly aware of how easily trust could be weaponized. I found myself scrutinizing every interaction, every request for personal information, not just at work but in my personal life too. The ease with which Carol had manipulated the system, from forging signatures to fabricating digital communications, made me deeply unsettled about the pervasive nature of deceit in the modern world. I started seeing a therapist, not just to process the grief over Grandma, but to unpack the trauma of the betrayal and the subsequent legal battle. She helped me understand that my hypervigilance wasn't paranoia, but a learned response to a violation of my trust. She guided me in rebuilding my sense of security and learning to distinguish between healthy caution and debilitating suspicion. It was a slow process marked by setbacks, but gradually I began to feel more like myself again, albeit a version tempered by hard-won experience. The house itself became a complicated space. It was Grandma's legacy and now mine, but every time I saw a familiar object, a favorite armchair, or the small wooden box where I'd found the damning evidence, I was reminded of the ugliness that had transpired within its walls. I eventually sold it. The memories associated with it were too tainted by the events, and I needed a fresh start, a place where my past wasn't etched into every corner. The most enduring consequence wasn't the legal victory or the financial outcome. It was the profound shift in my perception of family. I learned that blood ties don't guarantee loyalty, and that vulnerability can be exploited by those closest to you. It made me fiercely protective of my own boundaries and deeply appreciative of the genuine, honest relationships I do have. While I'm grateful for the legal vindication, the true lesson wasn't about proving Carol wrong. It was about discovering my own strength, my ability to remain calm and methodical in the face of immense pressure, and to fight for what was right, even when it meant confronting a family member. It taught me that while betrayal can shatter your world, it doesn't have to define it. Rebuilding takes time, resilience, and the courage to trust your own judgment, even when it's hard. The house is sold, the legal battles are over, but the internal work continues. And that, I suppose, is the real inheritance, the hard-won wisdom and the fortified self.